Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be able to speak to you this afternoon about the UK government review of potential spaceplane operations in the UK. And of course, it is potential. I've added that to the title because none of these have actually happened yet. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information about the government review that we've been involved with. The government review was initiated by BIS because of the background to the development of commercial spacplane operations. The plan for growth that the government put out in 2011 was that they wanted the UK to be the centre for space tourism, so this is very much an ambition for the government, and that they wanted to work with the regulatory authorities to define what type of requirements were needed to enable that to happen. And we're all aware, I think I've heard this mentioned several times today already, about the amount of input that the space industry provides in terms of contribution to the UK economy. And at that stage, in 2011, it was one of the few areas which was actually growing, and growing quite rapidly. And therefore it received quite a lot of support from the government. And in particular from David Willits, who's the Minister for Universities and Science at BIS. So last year, August 2012, there was a request from the government to the CAA to undertake a review, and there is a clause in the Civil Aviation Act that requires us to give advice to government in certain matters, and we didn't know that we were going to be responsible for any kind of space information, but apparently we are, so there we are. So what are we doing as part of the review? What we're going to look at is the extent to which the UK can support safe space tourism and payload operations. Looking at certification options, that's not medical certification in this context, it's airworthiness, so we have to do with engines and airframes and the actual space plane itself. We've also been asked to identify key characteristics of a spaceport, and I'll mention that a bit more as we go through. And also to assess the advantages, other than tourism and satellites, for the UK spaceplane activities. So you can see from that list, this review is quite broad-ranging. It's not particularly focused, and that was quite difficult for us to deal with when we were first given these objectives, because it's almost a blank sheet of paper. So the scope, really from my point of view, hones down into the first 3 bullet points on this slide. So we're mainly looking at suborbital commercial space passenger flights. That's primarily my focus. To some extent, we're looking at suborbital carriage of scientific payloads, and we're definitely looking at facilities for a spaceport. The other elements are not as imminent, so single stage to orbit is farther away in terms of timescale, and it's not as close. And the intercontinental very high-speed transport also is farther away in the distance, but we do need to consider it. And rocket engines is out of my scope entirely. So we started work this year in April officially, and we've been given a year to undertake this report. Now that sounded like quite a lot of time in April when I was given it. It's going incredibly quickly, and as I get farther into the work, I'm actually realising there's far more to this than I originally anticipated. And I want a little bit of help from the people in the audience here, and I'll explain about that later on. So the framework is set up. We've got our lawyers involved, there's always lawyers involved. International regulations, we needed to have a look at what the requirements were in different countries to see, where we were going to be likely to go in the UK. There's a specific airworthiness expert, there's an air traffic management expert, and an airspace expert. So they're looking at their individual specialisms. A person who's the chair of the group is an operations expert, and he's looking at all the different potential types of operations. Somebody's looking at the licensing and training of pilots, and I'm clearly looking at the medical aspects. We've also got our expert on UAS, that's unmanned aircraft systems, involved in the group, because some of these operations are likely to be unmanned. We've got an environment expert, anything to do with government at the moment, you definitely have to have the environment involved. And we've got one particular person who's looking at potential places for a spaceport and the facilities that you need for a spaceport. So we've started drafting. We're expected to produce a high-level summary by March, and I think the ambition is actually to produce the final report, which is going to be more detailed, in time for Farnborough next year. That's the plan. But the high-level summary, I certainly can't produce without producing my complete document and then honing it back down. So essentially, that means that work's got to be completed really quite soon. So we've got a project plan. We just have to have a project plan. Got all those people gathering lots of information. Several of our team went off to the States on an information gathering exercise, and I think it was very useful for them. I think on the medical side, I didn't go, and I didn't want to go because I don't think it's quite as relevant. I can liaise with the people that I need to at conferences both nationally and internationally, and with the use of the telephone and email. So I didn't actually physically need to go and see bits of kit or spaceports. And we've held several stakeholder events and met with several people from industry to clearly we need to know what's going on in the commercial world. That can be quite difficult. There are inevitably quite a lot of commercial sensitivities in this area. So gaining the information from industry, I in particular have found that to be a particularly difficult area. And so although we've got some general information, getting specifics, the exact amount of G, the exact amount of time spent at different altitudes, etc., that's been relatively hard to obtain. And getting information about particularly medical elements, has been my area where I'm lacking some information. So I said we looked overseas, and we certainly looked at what the US have done, because the US are the lead players in this. They've got legislation that underpins space launches. They've got this particular bit of legislation called the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act. And the FAA AST, which is the bit of the FAA which deals with space launches, has got legislation which has been published and is available to look at. But they're only concerned with the protection of uninvolved third parties. They're not directly involved with the vehicle occupants. One of the concepts that's used in the States, which I think is an extremely useful concept, is that of informed consent. So we feel, certainly in other areas of aviation activity, it's very important to give people an understanding of the type of activity that they're entering into, and then they can make their own minds up about whether they want to take the risks that are involved with that activity. And as such, these are likely to be termed adventurous aviation activities initially in the UK. That's the term that we'll probably be using. Now, interestingly, that US legislation doesn't just apply to US operators in the US, it applies wherever they are in the world. So if an FAA, a US operator comes over to the UK, they also need to abide by that legislation. So it's still very, very early in this process, and I've put at the bottom, that's the latest approximation of the number of launches that have been overseen by the AST. It's 216 vertical launches and only 4 spaceplane operations. So it's really very, very small. My colleagues went to speak to the people at NASA. They've clearly got wide experience of orbital ops, but again, not the suborbital area. As you're aware, a lot of the work from NASA has been transferred over to the private sector, so that has brought in a whole extra set of issues, really. Now, I put up the third bullet point because I think it's quite important. Both NASA and the FAA AST commented that an early catastrophic event in this area is going to lead to 2 outcomes: greater regulation or industry failure. This is initially high-risk activity. It's absolutely imperative that initially it is safe to safeguard that industry for the future. And the US, clearly they've got an extensive resource range, and there's lots of sharing of information in the US. So it's brilliant to see this type of gathering where we're starting to come together and share information within the UK, because that's really key to progressing this type of work. So in looking at a spaceport, a potential spaceport in the UK, we are very aware that it's not just space tourism, it's also scientific payloads that we need to be thinking about. Funding for a spaceport is very interesting. Now, in the States, individual states have vied for some of the spaceports and actually offered money to the government to induce them to actually have a spaceport in their area. It's considered not just prestigious, but also a potential source of boost to the local economy. So it's quite an interesting setup in the US. But they are in a very different situation to us. The US is massive. They've got lots of coastal areas, and they've got lots of unpopulated or very, very sparsely populated areas. So clearly very, very different situation to the UK. And they also have much better weather than us, which is also, it's quite an issue for this activity. There needs to be some thought about whether you mix a spaceport for horizontal launches and vertical launches, or whether that should be a combined spaceport. And that some of the lengths of the runways that I've heard have been absolutely huge that are going to be needed. And also the type of runway, you need a concrete runway, because asphalt doesn't always mix very well with some of the rocket fuels. So I've got a map here of the current US spaceports, and you'll see from the dots that are scattered around that they tend to be either coastal or in the middle of deserts. That's where they're all based. So this is the one that Virgin Galactic are due to operate from New Mexico. It's a spaceport in America. And one of my colleagues was there when they were doing one of the test flights, so I just put in a pretty picture. XCOR was mentioned earlier on as well. According to XCOR, the first flight will be in 2014, so it's planned for early next year. And currently, their aim is for operations to be in the Mojave Desert and at Kennedy Space Center. And as John mentioned earlier, they are planning to do several flights a day. That's the ambition. Skylab, well, we've got Mark from Reaction Engines here, who's going to be talking immediately after me. Skylab's an absolutely brilliant piece of engineering, so he'll be talking to us about that. But there are several other companies, European companies particularly, who are progressing quite rapidly in terms of their commercial ambition and in terms of their expertise and ability to actually undertake operations. So we've been talking to some of these companies and gathering some information from them. So some of the considerations we've had to think about, do we go for a UK legal framework or a European legal framework? And we've been in contact with EASA. I've put there that EASA has been in the loop. Clearly there is a framework for aviation, which is now well embedded across Europe and is a pan-European framework. So we've got that as a basis, but I'm not sure that in all areas you can directly transpose the aviation requirements over to the requirements for the pilots or the spaceplanes. So there's also considerations about space flight participants or passengers. So there's quite a lot of legal areas to think about in terms of, do we want requirements, do we want it to be guidance, and in what sort of format do we want these requirements? Certainly for the time being, the UK is pushing ahead and the European Commission is taking it more slowly. But I'm quite sure that whatever we do will be looked at by the Commission, and we're in close contact with the EASA to make sure that they're aware of what we're doing. Definitions has been a nightmare. I cannot believe how many hours I have spent sitting in a room talking about what is space, what is a rocket, what is a space plane, and what is a gas plane. I cannot believe. Get lawyers in a room, it really improves me. Anyway, I think they've honed it down to space. 100-kilometre limit is probably likely to be the limit that they're considering. And the lawyers are now pretty convinced that we haven't got any barriers in terms of various international bits of legislation. And there's an Outer Space Act which they've had to consider as well. But it's all been very interesting listening to the machinations going on. Clearly the way things are done in the States has been predicated by the fact that they have got a very particular type of geography. And that's what's led to their licensing methodology. And because of the difference in our population density and our different weather and our different climate and our different regional aspects, we have some areas where we need to think slightly differently. So what is the framework actually to do with? Well, I've been helped enormously by Pete in the room. Yeah, Pete Hopkinson has been helping me undertake this review because he's very knowledgeable in this area. And we've been looking at a number of areas where we need to develop requirements. Pilot medical requirements is the obvious one because that's got a direct analogy to the aviation world. Pilot training requirements is also being considered, so there's some element of medical in there as well. Cabin crew is a bit on the back burner Now, in the original videos that I saw from Virgin Galactic, they had cabin crew floating around the cabin with the passengers and then stuck in the back of their seats. I think at $250,000 a go, they're not going to be putting many cabin crew on board. So at the moment, I'm not aware of any operator who's intending to have cabin crew, but we've still got to think about it. Passenger medical requirements. Now, there are passenger medical requirements for aviation. Clearly, the operators have a responsibility that somebody is fit enough to travel, and there are some, lots of the operators have their own individual medical units to kind of passenger screen, but there aren't any specific requirements. And as I mentioned, I think informed consent is likely to be the order of the day for passenger medicals. And there are likely to be unmanned operations, but even where there are unmanned operations, there are going to be remote pilots. So we also need to think about medical aspects of those remote pilots. In-flight medical assistance is a really interesting area. The type of initial operations we like to see are only going to be an hour or two, or even less in duration. And medical assistance is not going to be as much of a concern. But when we start talking about farther trips that take longer or are going farther, then clearly that starts to become more of an issue. And we need to think about the medical regulations surrounding the spaceport as well, in terms of public health and potential emergencies. So the FAA recommended a second-class airman certificate for the pilot and an informed consent basis for carrying passengers. The EASA proposals I've put up there at the moment are just simply proposals from one or two individuals within the EASA, so there isn't a regulatory framework as such. But I put a note at the bottom about safety factors because in terms of rocket engine reliability, we need to think about the safety of the operations. From an aviation medical point of view, we're used to dealing with a certain level of risk. We know that that level of risk is much higher with the spaceplane operations. We know that there's been a certain risk and accident rate with space operations that is very different. And we haven't got any operational experience yet. So this is my plea. I told you I was going to ask you to do something at the end. I need information. The review is ongoing. We started to draft it, but any information that anyone has got and you think could input to that review is really important. What I'm trying to do is to get a feel for what facilities are available, what potentially we need in terms of infrastructure, what additional expertise that we're going to need, whether there should be collaborative efforts in some of these areas or whether it should be individual academic institutions, what type of requirements we need. I need to underpin all this with references. So if anybody has got any information that they think will contribute to this review, please give it to me. If it's not specifically about medical, I can pass it on to the people that are undertaking the other elements of the review. I've had some excellent help from a lot of people. I went over to see Simon at ESA, David Bradford's been helping me from King's, Jean-Bruno Marquiac at EASA has been very, very helpful, Kevin Fong at UCL, and a lot of people in the MOD, including the most important one has been Pete, because he's given me most enormous amount of his time. But any individual additional help, very much appreciated. And that's my contact, so if you do have any information, please do email me.